The Matrix. The movie franchise from the Wachowskis that single-handedly put the cyberpunk genre back on the map in the late 90s. It is one of the most well-known cyberpunk movies. And like the Wachowskis' revitalization of the cyberpunk genre on the silver screen, Polish developer CD Projekt Red is looking to do the same for video games with the upcoming Cyberpunk 2077. Since The Matrix was an original idea that turned into an unparalleled cultural legacy, I wanted to know where CD Projekt Red got their inspiration from. It turns out that it all goes back to a tabletop game in 1988 created by Mike Pondsmith. So, how did we get from an almost 30-year-old tabletop game to one of the most anticipated video games in 2020?
Yeah, credibility of 5, huh?
To figure this out, we need to take a few steps back. So let's start with what cyberpunk actually is. The genre didn't start with Blade Runner or with The Matrix. The origin of cyberpunk goes back to the 60s and 70s during a period called the New Wave Science Fiction movement. Writers were encouraged to examine new writing styles and unconventional storytelling. This all led to writers such as Roger Zelazny and Harlan Ellison that tried to explore the impact of drug culture and technology on dystopian societies. So, what does cyberpunk mean? The word cyber comes from cybernetic, which is a fusion between flesh and machine technology. Punk is from an early 1980s rock music style that represents violence, rebellion, and social action, but in a nihilistic way. The term cyberpunk was picked up by science fiction writers in the 80s, such as William Gibson, whose Neuromancer trilogy is considered to be one of the well-known cyberpunk works. The cover of the book basically screams 80s dystopian synthwave just by looking at it. Walter John Williams' Hardwired is also considered a major influence on the genre. Almost 2 decades later, in 1988, is where Mike Pondsmith comes in. He is a graphic designer in the video games industry. The work of William Gibson and Walter John Williams inspired Pondsmith so much that he wanted to replicate this gritty nature of the cyberpunk genre. His other influence was the tech-noir style of Blade Runner, and from those two he created his own tabletop RPG game.
Cyberpunk!
The first game, called Cyberpunk, was released in 1988 by Pondsmith's self-established R. Telsorian Games. The tabletop game takes place in a dystopian world in the year 2013, and most of the world's power has fallen into the hands of large corporations. Radical advancements in cybernetics has caused society to stop functioning effectively, as people cannot comprehend how to fit the technology into their lives. A small group of people decides to embrace the new technology and face the new future head on. These people are the cyberpunks. The second version of the game takes place in 2020 and focuses on Night City. This is the same Night City we've come to know in trailers for the upcoming Cyberpunk 2077. Night City was already introduced as an expansion pack for the original Cyberpunk, but it became the focus of Cyberpunk 2020, and it is the main area where players interact with each other. Other tabletop games followed later, like Cyber Generation, which was published in 1993, and Cyberpunk 3.0, which was published in 2005. The latest tabletop game, Cyberpunk Red, was released in 2019 and serves as a prequel to Cyberpunk 2077. That means that Cyberpunk 2077 is not a spin-off or something like that. It is the actual continuation of the canon. But Pondsmith didn't just work on tabletop games. After the tabletop role-playing game industry slowed down, Pondsmith turned his company into a part-time operation. In the year 2000 he starts to work for Microsoft Game Studios. At Microsoft he works at various projects and is credited in games like Mech Commander 2 in 2001, Stormfront Studios' Bloodwake, and Crimson Sky's High Road to Revenge in 2003. During his time at Microsoft he pitched the idea for a Matrix video game, but the project never came off the ground. After learning that Monolith Productions was going to work on a Matrix game, he eventually quits his job at Microsoft and joins the Monolith team. Here he works on post-launch content for the Matrix Online video game. So fast forward to 2012, where Mike Pondsmith receives a phone call from CD Projekt Red, asking him to collaborate with them on a Cyberpunk video game. CD Projekt Red at this moment in time was in the process of wrapping up The Witcher 3. It was already looking for a new challenge. It turned out that the developers are big fans of his tabletop games and they want to adapt his world into a video game. From that point on, the ball starts rolling, and during that same year CD Projekt Red announces the game Cyberpunk 2077 in May of 2012.
We are working on a Cyberpunk game, but not just a regular Cyberpunk game, on the Cyberpunk game. That's really important to stress.
We are now almost a decade later since Pondsmith joined Projekt Red. And there is no doubt in my mind that Cyberpunk 2077 will be an incredible combination of CD Projekt Red's storytelling and Pondsmith's amazing world. And although his pitch at Microsoft to work on a Matrix video game didn't work out as planned, he is finally able to bring his Cyberpunk into the digital world with his own video game. And whether if it's the Matrix or Cyberpunk 2077, he still got his Neo. We lost